Intellectual property, I think it's rather a sort of daunting phrase, really. It's a bit scary. I think it's maybe the word intellectual, but actually all businesses have got knowledge that they've created as part of their business, ideas, inventions. They could have created some media. All of this is intellectual property. Obviously for some businesses, like technology businesses and the creative businesses, where design and scientific ideas are very important, then intellectual property is really central to the whole enterprise. Now, with intellectual property, there's a series of things called intellectual property rights. So it's just all to do with things like, do you own the intellectual property? Or is it someone else's? In which case you're using it with their permission. So this is called licensing. If you've got your own intellectual property, of course you can let another company use it, and that's your licensing out your ideas. So that's the basic idea of intellectual property and intellectual property rights. And it comes in lots of different forms. Probably the most basic is all companies have got their own trade secrets and techniques that they don't tell their competitors or tell the world, but it's their sort of secret sauce of how they do things. And I suppose the most famous example is the recipe for making Coke. And I mean Coca-Cola here, where allegedly 3 people know how to make it, and maybe the recipe's in a safe somewhere. But it's certainly not public knowledge, and it's not patented. And I'll come on to patents in a minute. So all companies have got this know-how. It's really important stuff. The only way really to protect it is to keep it quiet and to rely on your staff and the people you're working with and your business partners to keep it confidential. So confidentiality is the first line of defense, really. Then you've got, far more widespread, you've got copyright. So if you're writing some computer software, for instance, or creating a website, or doing something that's creative and expressed in some sort of medium, then you're automatically creating copyright material. And we often see books and things with a little C symbol. That means someone's copyright, they're asserting their copyright over that material. And that actually can be incredibly valuable. People don't think of it necessarily as being as valuable as patents, but actually it certainly can be. And it's more applicable to things like computer software. So I come on to patents now. Patents, of course, we've all got this image of in our heads of the patent office with people lining up with their inventions, usually a model or something, sitting on their laps waiting to be called in. It's not quite like that. But patents are where you've come up with an idea which is novel, no one's thought of it before. It's inventive, which means it's not obvious. And you can have things which are novel but are pretty obvious. So it's got to be those two things. And the final thing, which is the most obvious one, I suppose, is it's got to be useful. So you can't have patents for things like works of art because they're not in that category. But of course, lots of inventions are protected by patents. And if you get a patent granted, you basically get a monopoly for the use of that idea for 20 years. So that's really very valuable. And that can apply in a particular country or several countries, depending on where you're trying to do business. But the only snag is that patents are quite expensive. So it takes a long time to get them, and you have to be able to spend thousands of pounds really pursuing patents. But nevertheless, if you're running a technology company, it's an important thing to have in your armory. And in general, what I like to do when I'm talking to people about intellectual property in business is trying to pick an appropriate approach or strategy, depending on the type of business it is, and how much money the business has, and what the investors think about intellectual property. And many, many investors like to have investments in a company that's got firm, solid intellectual property, so that it becomes really, really important. Why bother to do all this? I'll just conclude, because there's a fair bit of work. You've got to wrap your head around what it all means and develop the approach for your particular company. Well, I mean, the obvious one is it is a way of competing against others in your particular field. It can be a very valuable sort of competitive weapon. It's very valuable, as I've said, for investors. And if you come to the point where you're trying to sell the company or merge with another company, it's an enormously valuable sort of bargaining counter. So there's lots of other things that make a good company, including all the team, the people, the whole basic idea, but intellectual property is a pretty important ingredient.